Subjects that can grab everyone's attention is when you bring up subjects related to tznius. Now, right now in Kolel we're learning Hilchas Nida, Siman Kuf Tzadik, about Ksamim, and as part of the discussion we began at some point in the Siman, there's a detailed discussion about various body parts, various possible locations where a kesem might be found. Right? So in Sif Yud Aleph and Shulchan Aruch, we go through Akeva, Oirech, Shoka, Parsesa, Mibifnim, the parts that touch each other when she stands and puts Regel Beregel, Shok B'Shok. Further on, Reish Goidel, Ragleha Mamish, Al Yadeh, Kishrei Etzba'isa. Then we get back around to Shekem, Parsesa, Mitzad Chutz, Afilu Meyat Stadin. What if the Mak is B'Kseifa, V'Akesem Al Yerecha? Right, so that's the spirit of this if. Now it happens sometimes among those who sit and learn that there are certain details sometimes that don't feel so important. You don't pay so much attention to them. And one example I think is sometimes when you're learning Gemara or even Halacha and it starts mentioning body parts, sometimes you don't take the extra moment to pinpoint what exactly, precisely each thing is. Similarly for Grissim and Termusim, also there's certain things that not everyone stops to pay attention to. Of course, we already spoke about the Gris at length. So there were some in the light who actually stopped to pause and asked, what's this, what's that? If you look in the Beis Yosef, where the Beis Yosef gets into the background for the shok, mibifnim, mibachutz, so you look in the Beis Yosef, the Beis Yosef says it comes back to a Gemara. There's a Mishnah that says, Al Sheikav, Al Parsisel, Mibifnim Tmev, the stain is on the shake or the leg, on the foot, on the inside, she's Tameh. So the Gemara asks, what's the inside? What's the definition of Bifnim? So Amri Devei Rabbi Yanai, Ad Makaim HaChavek, till the Makaim HaChavek, or however you want to pronounce it, V'Chavek Atzmai Kilafnim. So Ad Makaim HaChavek is bifnim. Sounds like Mekayim HaChavek itself is not bifnim. But chavek, is it the same thing? Is it two different things? Not so clear. So the Beis Yosef quotes the Rosh, who quotes Rashi. And he quotes Rashi as saying, Chavek, Mekayim HaGidim, Shechayfkim, Hayerech v'Hashayk. If you look in Rashi in Nida, it's a bit longer. At Mekayim Chavek Safik, the Kamedumali, Shu Kefetz Hayerech v'Hashayk, Shekredin Yaret. So he's describing something that is the joint between the yerech and the shok. That's clearly what Rashi is saying. If you look up those who interpret the French and Rashi, they translate it as the joint, the knee sinew. So ka'amar ad makaim shu maschil kare pnim. Until where that starts, whatever that kefetz hayerech v'hashayk is, till there is pnim. And chevek, which it sounds like is something else, which is part of the pnim, he mesichas hagidin shechayfken hayerech v'hashayk yachad samach lo'isa kefetz. So there's, besides the kefetz of the yerech and the shayk, that's the mekayim chevek. Then there's the chevek itself. That's mesichas hagidin, some kind of other sinews that are covering the yerech and the shayk together. All right, not so clear. Not expecting that to be very clear, but that's what's going on here in this sugya nida. So the Rosh continues discussing that, then he says the Aruch has a different pirush, and in the Aruch itself, there are two pirushim. The second one is, Kisha Kefefes Sheika al Yarchav, she bends her sheik onto her yarech, so Masha Mechusim and Abasra Yedei, Kfifas HaSheik al HaYarech, Have Mekayim Chavek al Shem Shemachavik Mezazah. So if you, essentially he's describing, if you bend your knee, so you're bending the sheik on the yarech, so whatever part is hugging, kissing, touching over there, that's Mekayim Chavek, that's the hugging part. He has questions on that. And then the Beis Yosef has questions on that. And then the Beis Yosef says, the Rambam is very straightforward. It just says, stand, put 2 feet together. Whatever part of the 2 feet are touching on the inside, that's the inside. Definitely sounds a lot more straightforward. And he says that's why the Torah Taka just went with the Rambam and ignored everything else, because everything else is a headache. Even according to the Rambam, how does he explain? Mekayim Chavek. Okay. So we're not here to get into the details as to how to resolve the sugya and nida and understand it precisely. But to call attention to the fact that in the course of this discussion, we're saying yerech, shok. What is the yerech and what is the shok? What's the nafkamina? The nafkamina is tznius of women. And specifically nowadays, there are two major questions. Number one, how long does a skirt have to be? And who decided that it's till the knees? That's what everyone hears. And number two, what about the rest of the leg below the knees? Do they have to be covered? Do they not? If they do, the thickness of the socks, etc. So I'm not saying anything new. This is all just essentially a summary of what's become a very well-known discussion in the last few decades. And in short, as we shall see, the whole Welt, or much of the Welt, is relying to some extent on a tremendous chiddush, almost perhaps a mistake, in the Mishnah Brura on this inyan. As we shall see, this is a discussion, like I said, in many places. L'mashal, Rabbi Wiener and Kavod Bas Melech has his treatment of it. But for the purpose of the shiur, I made use of a work called Divrei Shalom. What is this work, Divrei Shalom? So to understand the context of this work, you have to understand that right now, the last few decades in Eretz Yisrael, there are what you might call the tznius wars. Bit of a cultural, there's a bit of a campaign, a tznius campaign. It could get sometimes a bit heated. Particularly against Sheitlach, they single out the wigs for particular bile, and to explain where that's coming from, let's back up even a bit more. More or less, overall, it seems that the way women dress has changed dramatically in the last 100 years or so, give or take. There's the way women dressed for centuries, for millennia. You can see old pictures of women from the Shtetlach, from Yerushalayim, from the Middle East. Very long, very covered. And in the wake of the tremendous changes in women's dress generally in the last 100 years or so, along with all the crises that Yiddishkeit went through during that period as well, so it's almost as if the frum mode of dress has been completely reinvented. So all of a sudden, there's the look, the blouse and the skirt till the knees, or the dress till the knees, much more figure-fitting. There's the sheitel that most women wear. That all happened within a very short time span. We went from one look to a completely different look. So that's why in Eretz Yisrael there's a bit of a movement that wants to argue that, hey, not all this is 100% legitimate. Of course, you have the extremists, the Kat Hashalim that wear a million layers in black. We're not going that far and that crazy. But those who focus, particularly, like I said, they like to zoom in on the wig, put out pamphlets and kontreisim and svarim, advertisements on every platform. Sometimes you'll see they have huge lists of all the poskim who supposedly answer the wig. Sometimes it's with threats and curses. Of course, there are those who also try to respond in kind, come up with a different list, argue, fight over who says what. So this work, Divrei Shalom, fits into this context. So first half talks about Sheitlach. We're not getting into that. But the second half, the other area of focus is Kisui Haregel. And that's what we're more interested in right now. And this work, Divrei Shalom, is anonymous. I haven't managed to figure out if anybody knows who it is. It has a bunch of askamas from some familiar rabbanim. The name, of course, is erased, so we don't know who it is. So I'm using this work because it does lay out the Makaitis very nicely. So on page 155 is where the Sheitel section ends, and the Kisui HaShok Bahalacha begins. And introduces it by saying that, of course, due to the unholy influence of the world, so we have the short skirts and we have the thin socks. It's terrible. It's all here to be megad of the Yetzer Hara. Okay. So where does the sugya begin? It starts in famous sugya Maseches Brachos. Tefach be'isha erva. Lamai. Why does this matter? The Gemara asks, why does this matter? You're not to stam look at another woman at all. It doesn't matter what. And not one's own wife. One can look at whatever one wants. So, l'ishto l'kriyashma. If one's near one's wife, whom one is allowed to look at, but one wants to say Dovid Shebekdusha Kriya Shema, so now you have to know that tefach be'isha erva. So whatever is usually covered, if there's a tefach that's uncovered, that's an erva. It's brought on the Rambam, brought in Turn Shulchan Aruch, that if there's a tefach megula of what should be covered, you're not to say Kriya Shema. Why? Because there's a hirher. You look in Alter Rebbe in Siman Ayin Hesev Aleph, tefach megula be'isha b'makam shidarka lachasais ervahu afilu hi ishtoi mepnei shemevi lidei hirher kishem mistakel boy. Balachin aser likres v'lespal kenegdoi, as if it was an erva mamash. But yesh matirin, if you're not mistakel, only if it's b'havara ba'alma, it's not really an erva, it's only mevi lidei hirher, so it's only a problem if you're mistakel, not b'riyah ba'alma, especially if you close your eyes. Yesh lismech al devreim k'sh'i efsher b'inyan acher. Yesh oimrim that the whole tefach is taka only be'ishtoi, isha acheres even less than a tefach, ein devreim ikar. Then the Alter Rebbe starts heading in the following direction. What about the parts that are allowed to be uncovered? Avol panel, v'yada, the face, the hands, shedarkan liyas megulim, right? The most cultures, even the most covered up women, you can still see their faces on their hands. That's always uncovered. Mutu likreis kenegdan, because you're already ragul behen eini bali day here. And he continues to the sheikh. We'll get to that in a second. Back to the Gemara. The Gemara continues and lists other things that are in erva be'isha. One of the things it says is, Omer of Chista, shok be'isha erva. The shok is an erva. What's the raya? It's a Yeshaya. It's talking about besulas bas bavel as an allegory for bavel, and it's using all kinds of, it goes very into the mashal of the girl from Bavel and how disgraced she is. So it says, K'chire chayim, tachani kamach, she's not in great shape. Gali tzamase ches v'shoivel, she's uncovering different parts. Gali shoik, ivri naharis. Uncover your shoik, cross through the river, not very respectable. And then the next pasuk says, tigal ervasech. So the Gemara says, gali shoik, tigal ervasech, shoik be'isha erva. What's the nafkamina though? Maybe there is no nafkamina. The Rambam and in his footsteps, the Mechaber of Shulchan Aruch, they don't mention anything about shoik be'isha erva. Why? Because we already said tefach. What is the shoik adding? And stam a discussion about where did the skirts go to. Apparently, it was not a discussion up until last 100 years. So it's not quite. That's not a nafkamina. So, but the Torah, in fact, does mention both in the context of Kriya Shema, tefach, megula, b'cheinim shoika megula. Okay, so what's the Torah? Now the question is on the Torah. What did the Torah add here? So if you look in the Alter Rebbe, which is based on this, so the Alter Rebbe says, we said, Paneh v'yadeh are fine, avol keneged shoika aser. Kiven shehu, and I'm skipping something, we'll get back to that in a second, kiven shehu mekoyin tsanua be'isha ervahi. So the chiddush is, hagufa, you would think that shoika maybe it's like Paneh v'yadeh. So I'm telling you, no, shoika is not like Paneh v'yadeh, so it's the same din as tefach. But yesh oimrim that there is a difference. Shafilu paches mitafach shemagula b'shoika ervihi afilu be'ishtoi. This is the taz that tefach is generally, but b'shoika it's even less than a tefach. So that's why you have to say both. V'nachin lachish l'devreim. We'll get back to the full sentence of the Alter Rebbe in a moment. So based on this, especially based on the first point that the Alter Rebbe said, Mokim tzanua be'isha ervihi. Now we have an nafkamina in tznius generally. So that means if it doesn't have the din paneh v'yadeh, it doesn't matter what the people there do. There's no minhag hamakim. Minhag hamakim doesn't apply to something that's inherently an erva. So that means that if we were to ask what has to be covered, now we would know from here in Siman Ayin Hey that it must be covered under all circumstances. But what now, of course, is the shoik after all that? So this is where it's discussed in these halachas. We'll start with the Mishnah Brura because that's really where this discussion takes off. The Shulchan Aruch said, Tefach megula be'isha b'makam shedarka lechaseisei. So the Mishnah Brura in Tzivkat and Beis says, Avol paneh v'yadeh kafi haminig shedarach liyas megula b'isa makam. There's room for variation depending on the minig. Then here comes the key line. V'chein be'parseis regel ad hashoik. Same din as paneh v'yadeh. The leg ad hashoik. Where's the shoik? V'hu ad hamakim shenikra kni b'lashon Ashkenaz. So the Mishnah Brura said that the regel, ad ha-shoik, ad ha-kni, till the knee, is the same as paneh v'yadeh. That means the shok only begins from the knee onwards. The place where they will go barefoot, because you're used to it just as much as panav v'yadeha. But if they do cover it, then shiur and tefach, k'may sh'ar guf isha. And that's only parsis regel ada shok. Her arms and legs, proper. I'll feel it again. Leilach megula, kederech haprutzis. If you happen to live in a place where people are prutzis, doesn't change anything, still aser. So he's saying the same thing pretty much as everyone. You're not allowed to megal the shok like the prutzis, but how did he define the shok? He said, Adam makim shenikra kni. So like we said, it seems like the shok begins from the knee and goes upwards. This is where the discussion really erupts. Let's take a look and compare what other achreinim say here in Siman Ayin Hey. Let's go back to the Alter Rebbe. Let's take a look at the full sentence now. Aval keneged shoka asur. What does the Alter Rebbe say? Afal pisha shok eini mokim tsanua beish. Even though for a man the shok is not a place he has to cover, shedar kilias megula. It could be uncovered, but mekayim is shahochen belay an pelois, in places where they go without socks. Kiven shu mokim tsanua beisha ervahi. That's the full sentence in the Alter Rebbe. What's the Alter Rebbe talking about? Clearly, the Alter Rebbe is talking about not above the knee. That's not where the socks go, and that's not a place that a man would uncover. We're talking about the lower part of the leg. Look at the Chayyim here, in it's whatever, it's Klal Daled, but it corresponds to Siman Ayin Hey. V'chein parsis ragleha, and it seems like the Mishnah Berurah almost borrowed the language, but it's missing that part in the middle. V'chein parsis ragleha, b'makim shederech leilach yachif muter, avos reisel v'sheika afilu regilin b'kach kederech haprutis aser. So the Mishnah Berurah inserted a whole thing about ada shoik shenikra kniya, but if you take that out, it sounds like parsis ragleha, barefoot. That's literally just talking about the part that you call barefoot, which is the bottom of the foot. Avos reisel v'sheika, presumably the Chayyim means everything upwards from there is the shok. Mishnah Berurah is the one who changed things around. Look at the Aruch HaShulchan. The Aruch HaShulchan, when he's trying to for why we mentioned both, he likes the first oifen that the Alter Rebbe uses. He brings it b'shem the Rishonim, the Rosh, the Dovid, that the chiddush is that the shok is an erva, even though some people are barefoot. Beleka beragleha mishum gili erva. So that could taka be panav yadeha and ragleha, the part that's barefoot. V'komakim b'shok hakavoya meharegel yesh by mishum erva. So it sounds like he's saying the barefoot part is the regel, and the shok is l'maylam from that. But you don't have to just rely on the Aruch HaShulchan here. They point out that there's much clearer words in the Aruch HaShulchan and another halachic topic where this is important, which is, of course, chalitza, especially for Kolel young Galite who went to witness a chalitza, particularly if someone where there's a shiloh over where the shok is. So in Even Ezer, in Siman Kuf Samach Tes, Siv Chavav, the Aruch HaShulchan says, it says in the Mishnah regarding chalitza, min ha'arkuva lamata, chalitza sakshera, min ha'arkuva lamayla, chalitza psula, arkuva is the knee. So the Aruch HaShulchan says, ubir advarim, the regel nikra kafa regel, sheboy ha'etzporis. When we say regel, we mean literally the foot where the toes are. Ubegoiva, and height, how high does it go? Hu ad ha'atzamois ha'bertas mikan u'mikan shenikra knechel b'l'sheinenu. The ankle. That's the goiva ha'regel, the ankle. U'b'loshin Gemara, Loshin Mishnah, the kursel. U'misham u'lamayla maschel ha'shok v'hoilech ad ha'arkuva u'b'l'sheinenu kni. So Aruch HaShulchan is being as clear as possible that the shok starts from the ankle and goes till the knee. U'b'loshin mikra berkayim u'v'yachid beirach. These are the terminologies. So you have three Gedolei Achreinim and Siman Ayin Hey that are clearly saying the opposite of the Mishnah Berurah. Not only that, in the 80s, there was a work by the name of Mekar Chaim on Shulchan Aruch that was printed. It was authored by Rav Yor Chaim Bachrach, the Chavis Yar. He lived mamish in the same time period as the Magen Avraham, so he's from the Tkuf of the Neis HaKelim. And he also wrote, he could have also been one of the Neis HaKelim, but it wasn't printed at the time. It was in Ksav Yad till the 80s, and then that's when it was printed by Machon Yerushalayim. And sometimes you find that he has interesting discussions that may be predated the later discussions in Achreinim. So we find here, in Siman Ayin Hey, he says, Tefach megula b'isha v'makom shedaka l'chasaysay, and that includes the shok. Rashba says, Panei Yadav Ragla, Ein Choshishin Lahem, Umahu Shok, Nida Shehu Etzem HaTachtin HaArich. It's the long bone on the bottom, Hazakuf Af k'she'adam yoshev, that's upright, even when a person is sitting. I assume he means on a chair. That's the part that's straight. And the Rashba is only being matir midrach kaf ragal, only the part of the foot that actually steps. And then he starts bringing rayas. He says in Shoftim, it describes, it says, V'yach oisam shok al yerech. So you see the word shok and the word yerech, and they're separate. And he quotes from Rashi that Reichev asus einay nishan al yerechoi. A horse rider isn't leaning on his yerech. Rak al shoykoi. But barzel hatolei, there's a metal on the side. The shok is in there. Clearly that's the bottom of the leg. And then he starts quoting different places in Torah where it just says yerech or just says shok, and he's just trying to convey that you see that they mean different things. So he says, it says in the Torah by a saita, it's yerchech nefelas. He says, what does that mean? What is that supposed to mean? He says that's essentially a kinoi le'erva. Shesham hayah. We don't like to say the makayim erva and Tanakh, so we have euphemisms. So as yerechech nefelas really means oisamakim. So that is associated with the yerech. The yerech is right there. In the kisavai, on the other hand, you have ala birkayim, ala shekayim. That's the knees and below the knees. You have Yotze Yerech Yaakov. Descendants are called Yotze Yerech. Weiter, a euphemism. It means that he birthed them. He doesn't mention this, but of course another example is Simno Yodcha, Tachas Yerechi, right? The Taich is the bris. But we don't want to say that. It's a euphemism. So the Yerech is very much close to that area. So that goes together. You never see a shok being used in that way. Chagar Charbacha Yerech. You see that the sword goes on the thigh. Not the same thing. And then he's mitzayin to another eye, and then he mentions also in Chagiga, describes the Chayas HaKodesh Lamayla, and how each part of the Chayas HaKodesh is huge. So it says, Raglei Chayas Keneged Kulam, and it goes up. Karsulei Chayas Keneged Kulam, Shekei Chayas Keneged Kulam, Rechuvei Chayas, which is the knee, Yarchei Chayas, Gufei Chayas, so you can literally follow up the body, and you see how Shek, knee, Yerech. So these are the details that you would see from Hilchos Kriyas Shema. When it comes to the general question as to how do people dress once upon a time, they're actually mitzayim back to here in Siman Kuf Tzadik. Here, look in the Beis Yosef here in Siman Kuf Tzadik. The Rosh ben Teres Abayis says, it says, Avra b'shuk shel tabachim, she's going through the meat market, right? So the question is where the blood came from, but if the blood came from outside, why is it only on her body and not on her clothing? If it's only on her body and not on her clothing, it seems like it came from the inside. So the Rosh says, it doesn't mean that it's impossible for blood from the meat market to only strike her besara. It could be her clothing folded up and it was able to hit her. Or even from the bottom it can come up. So what's the reason, Ebazoi? Why are we saying it? It sounds like we're saying it is impossible. It is possible. The Rashba says that is a psalamdus, is a chazaka. Because the body produces blood, so when you find it on the body and not on the baguette, so then that chazaka kicks in. It says, Taisvis gives a different reason. Taisvis says that lahagbiya es kulan, if she's wearing multiple layers, lahagbiya es kulan, ein regila, shelo yera b'sara. She would never pick up all of her layers of clothing. So it is impossible, according to Taisvis, it's literally impossible for the blood to hit her. But it doesn't make sense, because everyone should be moided, should be able to come up from the floor. So if it comes up from the floor, the Rosh was willing to say it's also possible for nikpulu begadel. So what do we see from here, from this discussion? We see the assumption is that when the clothing are on properly, it would be impossible for any blood to ever hit her, because everything is covered. According to Tosfos, that's absolute. According to the Rashba, it's possible to fold all the clothing up and something can hit her. They're also mitzayin to interesting tshuva of the Radbaz. The Radbaz was asked about the din in brachas achrei ari, to walk behind the woman. Different discussion, but touches on this. They ask, what about in the Islamic countries where the women are covered from head to toe, they're completely covered, as we know? Is that less of a problem? Can you walk behind the woman? So he says, no, Chazal didn't leinastu devrem l'shiyurin, kol hanoshim, kol hamakaymis, all the same. It has nothing to do with looking at makim hamagula, that's always a problem. It's hilucha tnueseha, just the movement, the motion, that's problematic. And then he adds, the milei askin and the bizman chachmei atalmud hayunashim hochas mechusais, they're also completely covered. Then he goes on in this vein, how it's mamish, we don't have time to being a fire, it's not so negea. Obviously, that's its own discussion, and Achrein today say that nowadays in the West, where women are sharing the streets equally with men, it's just not, the halacha isn't the same. And Mitzrayim, the Baz is following the Rambam. We know that Rambam famously says about women staying home, leaving once a month, so totally different culture and circumstances. Another thing that's pointed out is that in that sugya back in Brachas, Tavach be'isha, shok be'isha, the question of what does shok add, the question on the Gemara itself. There are so many shaytim that say that even though the shok is something that while a woman is walking she might uncover slightly, it's something that gets uncovered here and there. The chiddush is that it still has a din of a makim mechus, even though it could be partly uncovered on occasion. The time the Tosfos Rosh, there in Brachas, Amr of Chista shok be'isha erva, delight tema po amr she'isha magbas begadeha, ve'ein dark aliyas mechus. So sometimes she picks her clothing up, kamash malan da'avi erva. And you see this concept of lifting the clothing sometimes while walking in different places in Chazal. In Brachas, there with Achayri Isha, it says, Kol ha'ever Achayri Isha b'nar, ein lachelek le'el ma'bar. Rashi says, what's going on? Achayri Isha's ish, magbas begadeh mepnei hamayim. She's picking up her clothing and she has to cross through the water. Mizem istakelba, and this guy, this creep is staring. But Basra, it says, different context, she'ein darken shel b'nai Yisrael is bazri sala kvisa. It's too disgraceful for Jewish girls to be doing laundry the old-fashioned way. The Rashbam explains, have to stand there barefoot, legales shok lamed banar, to uncover the shok. So what are all these Makaidas talking about? They're not talking about lifting clothing all the way up to the waist. Obviously they mean lifting it up to the knee. And that's what the Tosfos Rosh is saying in Brachas Gufa, that's the pshat. Even though sometimes they lift the skirt up, it's still makam ha'mechusa. Another place shok is mentioned is in Shabbos, B'mei Isha Yoitza. If you look in Alter Rebbe in Shin Gimel, Yoitza is B'vati Shekayim, or in its Oda, on the Zrei or the shok, a pashta is a bracelet and an anklet. B'vati Shekayim are socks, things along those lines. Look in Alter Rebbe in Berchas Koyanim, Siman Kuf Chav Ches, Koyanim can't wear shoes, Aval B'vati Shekayim, Mutarim. What are we talking about? We're talking about tall socks. Even if it's not attached to the pants, even if it has its own string, the chashash by a shoe is the shoelaces might rip and he'll start sitting down in the middle and it's going to create a whole scene. What if the sock bursts open? He'll also say, no, shoes are more of a busha, so he's going to stop in the middle. But the shekayim, he won't. What about the shekayim? It's clear that but the shekayim are the things that cover the shok. Those are socks. So where did the Mishnah Berurah get this idea from? Is this a total mistake? No, it turns out there is a prima gadim here in Siman Ayin. Hey? He says, shok is from the arkuva, it's from the knee, and he's mitzayin to some halachas lagabi the shok of a behema. And then the prima gadim continues and says, nimtza kol haregel ad arkuva shekoyrin kni, sham b'makim shehochen yachif, u'megula efshir ein chashash. So the prima gadim says, from the leg till the knee, could be tzarach shash. So it's clear that he understands that, seemingly, that the shok is taka from the knee up. But science to some Makaidas. Now, so he seems to be equating the shok of a person with the shok of a behemoth. Now, we all have heard of chaz of a shok. Again, I don't know if we've stopped to ask ourselves what that is. But it seems that when it comes to the shok of a behemoth, indeed, it's not referring to the bottom part of the leg. It's referring to from the knee to the next section. So it seems like the Prima Gadim wants to make a comparison to the person. But this is already a discussion in Rishonim. There's a Tosfos in Menachos that talks about what's the Zraya for Tefillin. You know, the Tefillin goes on the Zraya. Where's the Zraya? So he wants to compare it maybe to the Zraya of a behemoth. So he says, Miu ein raya mi Zraya de behemoth le Zraya de Adam, de ha-shok de Adam nami le'avik ha-shok de behemoth. Don't compare Zraya because you shouldn't compare a shok. The Tanan Ba'alis, and all this talks about all the Ivarim and the Adam, and also goes from the bottom. Pieces of regel, kursel, shok, arkuva, yerech. So you see, Almazak Tosfos, Kari shok, etzem ha-mechuber le-regel. So you see that the shok is the thing that's connected to the foot. There's also some Sefer on this, Rabbi Chalitza, someone who was amputated, and he says, V'aklal le'nikra ba'adam regel ela ha-parsa tachtoina. Those are the three parts. And see the Mishnah in Haraya Kesem, Dafran Ches, Rashi and Tosfos, Mekayim Chavek. So we got back to where we started. From Taka Pirush Rashi, and from the Pirush Aruch that's quoted in Tosfos, we see clearly the way it's describing either where the Yerech and the Shok are connected, or when you fold the knee and the Yerech or Shok have a chavek. Some Sefer is saying, here's another ayataka to what we're saying. It says, there's a Tosfos Yom Tov and Alos. The Tosfos Yom Tov also got confused with the animal versus the person. Now, there is a bit of a discussion about taka. What does the Tosfos Yom Tov hold? What does the Pri Megadim hold? Some want to even argue that maybe they don't hold what they seem to hold, but we're not going to get into that. The question is, what do we do l'maisa? We might go another minute or two overtime. The Metzias is skirts, clothing, it's not going down to the ground anymore. In fact, today, in our circles, it's considered a bit not edel if it goes too far, too low down to the ground. So what's the maskana if we had to sum it up? So if you want to go all the way with the Mishnah Brura, so that would mean you don't have to wear socks. You can wear a skirt till the knees, no socks, and you're fine because that's part of the regel, it's not the shok. But most paiskim are machmer, and that's where you get the idea from of what people jokingly refer to as bulletproof stockings. Look in the Shevet HaLevi. In fact, the Shevet HaLevi, Chelek Aleph, Siman Aleph. The first thing you see when you open the first Shevet HaLevi. And he goes through all these Makairas, the Gemara Brachas, Shulchan Aruch, Mishnah Brura, Chayad, and Pri Megadim. We don't have time to repeat it all, but he says, essentially, look at all these Makairas. The Makairas clearly suggest the shok is on the bottom, and therefore there's no heter to go without socks. That was the question. We know famously regarding Satmar, when the Satmar Rav came to America, there's a famous drasha that he held when he saw how the women were dressing, and specifically he zoomed in on the thickness of the socks, the stockings, and the drasha is printed, and they say he sat there and he tested on his hand to see what he felt was thick enough, until he announced that it has to be 70 denier, very thick measurement. Right, so at this point, no one is arguing that it should go down to the ground, and so that means on some level we have to accept that, of course, you can't wear stockings all the way up without a skirt. So up until the knees, the din tznius for some reason is you mamash have to fully cover it around and around. You can't see the tzuras haregel. From the knee and down, it has to be, you can't see the skin, but the shape is not as much of a problem. Although some takas say, the ones who are more machmer takas say that it has to cover halfway between the knee because the top half of the shok is still a little thicker. So that's where you get the idea of the thickness of the stockings or the color. They have a dark brown, the ones who are machmer. They might have a stripe also to show you that it's not the real, you shouldn't be fooled into thinking that it's the skin. Just one more minute. Rabbi Brain, to quote a Chabad Rav, Rabbi Brain has addressed this a number of places, once in his Halacha to Go series, and again on AskTheRav.com. So the way he sums it up is you have this question of where the shok is. He says the consensus among Poskim, including the Alter Rebbe, is that the shok is the lower part of the leg, and accordingly it has to be completely covered in a theistic manner. So a woman's dress or skirt has to reach below her knees and conceal the shape of her body. It needs to be long enough to ensure complete coverage of her knees even while she is sitting, etc. Even if her skirt covers her knees, her legs must be adequately covered by tights or stockings, but these do not need to conceal the shape of her legs. Even according to Mishnah Brura, though, you have to cover with something. And then he goes in his Mar Makaimis, the Yuj Harichis, more or less covering the same points. He mentions the Tzemach Tzedek in a different context in Even Ezer. The Tzemach Tzedek says, "Hanoimar shem yenagu legal shaykum yimei hakayed zman hachaim yiyah muter sharei nagu kain yishtaka adav v'layom the kiven shu erva." You can't have a minig. Leimahani minig. Uminig kazehu oisius gehenim. So here you see the Mishnah, the Tzemach Tzedek, assuming that he understands the shayk the way we do. He also mentions regarding stockings that we don't paskin that as extreme as some of the other communities, even though we essentially hold the same shita ba'atzem that the shayk is below and is an erva. So he says the number 40 is 40 and up. That's we go with the number 40. He mentions there's a letter from Rabbi Chadakov from Merkis to the camp in Kfar Chabad in Tov Shalamed Gimel. He says we've got a terrible news about the girls' camp. Even though everything overall was fine and it left a good mark, but the tznius wasn't okay. For example, they were walking barefoot, and not just in the Dal and Amis of the campgrounds, but even walking around the kfar. And word spread, and everyone's talking about it, and you can imagine the Chilul Hashem. So we're asking to confirm, and is this true? And if it is, please make sure that this doesn't happen again. And again, he concludes that at least 20 denier according to the Alter Rebbe, it should be more, and many say that it should be at least 40 denier. V'chein moedim kamer b'nei anash v'hamachmer tavoi alav bracha.